Hi everyone, welcome to the next video in our series on Wordsworth, and in this video we're going to look at our first poem together. This one is Tintern Abbey, or to give it its full title, Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey in revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour July 13th, 1798. A very snappy title, obviously, but seriously, the title does serve a few very important purposes. It gives us information about the time, the place, the location, and the fact that he's revisiting this area. The time is July 1798. The place is the Wye Valley in Wales. The location is above the Abbey, thereby giving him a view of the whole landscape. And the fact that he's revisiting means he's coming back. There's something different this second time round. We're going to begin our study of this poem by looking at some contextual information. For more detailed information on the context and background to Wordsworth, have a look at the first video in this series if you haven't already, where I go through some of the really important aspects of Wordsworth's life and how it relates to his poetry. For this specific poem, there is some context that is important to know. The poem was written in July 1798, the beginning of Wordsworth's great decade, and he's at Tintern Abbey, the ruins of a great abbey near Wales. He had been here before, in 1793, not long after he had returned from France. It was a time of great turmoil for him. He had left his lover, Annette Fallon, an unborn child in France. He didn't know what direction his career or his life would take, and the natural beauty that he encountered here helped to soothe his soul. He revisits it in 1798, in his mind a very different man, but the landscape has remained the same. Wordsworth was well known for changing his poems in the years after he had written them. From 1812 through to his death in 1850, he did little else, but he never changed Tintern Abbey. He has said that, and this is a direct quote, "No poem was composed under circumstances more pleasant for me to remember than this. I began upon leaving Tintern after crossing the Wye, and concluded it just as I was entering Bristol in the evening, after a ramble of 4 or 5 days with my sister. Not a line of it was altered, and not any part of it was written down till I reached Bristol." It's also worth reminding ourselves of some of Wordsworth's big ideas, his key concerns when it came to poetry. Remember from the first video on context in this series, we saw that Wordsworth wanted to create a new type of poetry. Poetry that used the ordinary, everyday language of ordinary men. Poetry that focused on subjects that were of interest to ordinary people. He also had a deep connection with nature and saw nature as the solution to stress, emotional suffering, and other difficulties that people might face. One final thing before we begin to read this poem, it's written in blank verse. The lines are unrhymed, but there's a metrical rhythm to the poem. We will go through this later, but see if you can identify it from the sound. We're going to look at the poem in 5 sections. You should really read it all in one go to get a sense of the sound and the rhythm and the movement in the language, but for our purposes here, we're going to break it up. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters, and again I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on a wild secluded scene impress thoughts of more deep seclusion, and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day is come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore, and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue, and lose themselves amid groves and copses. Once again I see these hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees. With some uncertain notice, as might seem of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. Okay, so what's happening in these lines? Well, the speaker says that it has been 5 years since he was last in this place, and he now again is able to hear the sounds of the river and see the scenery around him. This scenery has a big impact on how he thinks, and he is able to enjoy it again watching from his position under a sycamore tree. He describes the cottages and little groups of trees that he can see, and the fruit on these trees is not yet ripe, and so it's green, just like the surrounding countryside. He describes the hedges dividing the fields as little lines, and the lines of smoke going up from the middle of the trees. This suggests to him that wanderers or vagrant dwellers must be unseen in the trees sitting around a fire, or a hermit, a person who decides to live entirely alone away from society, may be sitting by a fire on his own. So now that we know what the lines mean, what can we say about them? Well, there's a repetition in the opening lines that emphasizes that this is a return. It's 5 years, and again he hears and sees the sights of this place. The speaker makes reference here to the idea of a deep connection between nature and man when he says that looking at the wild secluded scene creates thoughts in his mind of a more deep seclusion. So looking at the natural scene in front of him prompts him to think deeply about existence and spirituality. The unripe fruits is an interesting choice of image, and it could suggest how the younger version of himself is unripe, in the sense that he has not fully come to appreciate nature and the power it has. As we see in later verses, in his younger years, the speaker simply looked at nature. He didn't feel it. Towards the end of the first section, the speaker describes wreaths of smoke, and he speculates it could be from a fire lit by some vagrants or a hermit. The word hermit in the poem is capitalized, denoting its importance, and it is also repeated. The last line of the verse paragraph is broken and separate from the rest of the poem, reiterating the idea that the hermit is separate from society. Here, Wordsworth may be suggesting his envy of the hermit, that this is a position he would like to be in. These beauteous forms through a long absence have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye. But oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities I have owed to them in hours of weariness sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. Feelings too of unremembered pleasures, such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little nameless unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Nor less, I trust, to them I may have owed another gift, of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, that serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on, until the breath of this corporeal frame, and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and becoming a living soul, while with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things. So these lines from 23 to 50, these beautiful things in nature have for a long time been invisible to him. He hasn't physically been there to see them, but they have nourished him all the same. Amongst the crowds, in cities and in lonely rooms, he has been able to remember this place and the natural beauty of it, and it has revitalized him. He has felt a physical, mental and a moral improvement in himself simply remembering these sights. He goes on to talk about nature generally and how it can help people to restore their mood and to give them solace when they worry about the world. He begins here to drift into his ideas about religion, pantheism, and where God is to be found in nature. Everything becomes suspended when you are amongst nature, and you can be still and relax, and this stillness can lead you, like meditation, to higher or greater truths. Okay, so when we look at these lines from 23 to 50, there's a few things that we could talk about in terms of our analysis. There's imagery here surrounding the idea of sight and sense. The landscape, though not in front of him for the last 5 years, has not been completely absent as it would have been to a blind man. He has seen it once, and the memory of that he has kept with him. Further in this section, he refers to the eye made quiet by the power of harmony. There's a contrast also between the power and beauty of nature and the loneliness and noise of the city. There is irony that the loneliness is felt by the speaker when he is in the middle of a place with lots of people, and yet he is not lonely when he is in nature where there's almost no one. This section also details some of Wordsworth's main beliefs about the power of nature. The beauteous forms of the landscape delight the senses. They are a pleasure to behold, and this is the most primitive, the most basic level of engagement. The memory of the natural world and the landscape he beheld helped to sustain him in the years that he's been away living in towns and cities. The first benefit of the natural world to man is a physical restoration. The exhausted man is restored, felt in the blood and felt along the heart. The next one is mental. The loveliness of all he has seen restores his mind, and he feels it passing even into my purer mind. Then there is the moral one. Nature as a guide that teaches him and helps him to do good things, the little nameless unremembered acts of kindness and of love. But this isn't some sort of direct instruction from nature. Rather, the mood and the emotional state that nature inspires in man causes these good deeds to unfold within him. The section ends with a reference to this greater awareness or this higher truth. Through a deep and meaningful engagement with the natural world, man will be able to see into the life of things. If this be but a vain belief, yet oh, how oft, in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, how oft in spirit have I turned to thee, O sylvan Wye, thou wanderer through the woods, how often has my spirit turned to thee? So let's take a look at what's happening in these lines. This is the shortest verse paragraph of the poem, and it's a restating of his belief in the power of nature. He's saying that if his belief in what he has said about nature restoring man physically, mentally, and morally is just a belief and not a fact, then how is it that he has often turned to the memory of the River Wye to restore his spirit in difficult times, and it's done just that? In terms of our analysis, there's a few things that we can say about these lines. There's imagery here linked to emotional and mental suffering. The speaker talks about the darkness and the joyless daylight. This is connected with his experiences of the city and the urban environment. In these places, life is unprofitable and people go around as if in a fever. There's an interesting point to be made here about Wordsworth's poetic aims. We know that he wanted to write poetry in the everyday language of men, and yet when he gets excited in his verse, he uses traditional classical poetic vocabulary like thou or thee. And similarly, in the previous verse paragraph, he uses the phrase corporeal frame to refer to the human body. As much as he wants to write using ordinary language, it seems that sometimes he just can't help himself. And now with gleams of half-extinguished thought, with many recognitions dim and faint, and somewhat of a sad perplexity, the picture of the mind revives again, while here I stand, not only with the sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thoughts, that in this moment there is life and food for future years. And so I dare to hope, though changed no doubt from what I was when first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded o'er the mountains by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams, wherever nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. For nature then, the coarser pleasures of my boyish days and their glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood, their colours and their forms, were then to me an appetite, a feeling, and a love, that had no need of a remoter charm. By thought supplied, not any interest unborrowed from the eye. That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures. Not for this faint eye, nor mourn, nor murmur, other gifts have followed. For such loss, I would believe, abundant recompense. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still sad music of humanity, nor harsh nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime, of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains, and all of that we behold from this green earth, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they half create and what perceive, well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense, the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being. Okay, so this section is quite long, but it's actually pretty straightforward, although it doesn't sound it. The memories of his first visit begin to come back to him, and he thinks about what he was like in this place as a younger man, how he interacted with nature and the landscape. He recognizes that he has changed now, and that he's different. He focuses on the elements of the landscape that particularly affected him, and then acknowledges that that time in his life is gone, and now he focuses on what has replaced it. He says that he has a deeper appreciation of nature now, and that it offers him more than it did when he was younger. He begins to talk about what nature now offers him, an almost meditative state of mind, where he can connect to his own spirituality. He considers the idea of a god, or what we think of as God, through his appearance in the natural world. He then goes on to explain that the world we experience is half created by us and half created by nature. Whatever we see or hear with our eyes and ears is mixed with the signals that nature sends out, and together they create our reality. At the end of this verse paragraph, the speaker definitively says that nature is the one constant in his life and the thing from which he gets his morals and his guidance. So in these lines, Wordsworth is essentially setting out his beliefs in the power of nature and what it can do for man. He begins by saying that his memories from the previous visit were half extinguished until he came back, and now his memory has been revived. The sad perplexity is an acknowledgement that he has changed in the last 5 years, and in that time has lost something of his former self. There's also a distance and maybe the guilt of those years prevents him from closing that distance between his current self and his former self, as he acknowledges, I cannot paint what then I was. Perhaps because then he had no knowledge of the sublime and no feeling towards nature. He tells us that former self was almost animal-like in the way it interacted with nature. He uses the simile, when like a roe I bounded, to emphasize that he wasn't stopping to enjoy the natural world. He was experiencing it as an animal might, entirely through the senses such as the eyes and ears, not the mind. Interestingly, he continues this theme by saying that he was like a man flying from something that he dreads, than one who sought the thing he loved. Considering he was first here, after returning from France, when he was full of guilt for abandoning his pregnant lover, these lines are quite telling. There's a point here on structure too, as the speaker moves us from the past to the present in the course of this first paragraph, emphasizing the development in his character and personality. He moves from describing how he engaged with nature as a younger man to the present. The use of the dash, which is a type of caesura, in line 85, that time has passed, brings the recollection of his younger days to a close, and he moves on to the present. He says that what he has lost in the intervening years, he has been more than repaid for through his new appreciation of nature on a deeper, more spiritual level. In the rest of this verse paragraph, Wordsworth develops his pantheistic views. Essentially, Wordsworth's pantheism means that he believes that God, and here he doesn't mean a Christian God, his version of God is present and exists in the world around us and in everything that we see and in our interaction with it. This is encapsulated in the lines, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of thought, and rolls through all things. This idea is further developed when the speaker suggests that what we see and hear in the world around us is half created by us, by our senses, and half created by nature. In that case, nature plays a very big part in how we see the world. The final lines here are interesting as they are almost a personal declaration. He says that nature is the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul, of all my moral being. The images of the anchor, the nurse, and the guardian are quite informative here. The anchor keeps him stable and grounded like a boat in rough weather. The nurse is there to alleviate his suffering and to heal him, while the guardian is there to keep him safe. Nature then, for Wordsworth, is vitally important to his well-being, and he believes that it is not just for him that nature can work in this way, but for everybody who engages with and who loves nature in the way that he does. Okay, our last section. If I were not thus taught, should I the more suffer my genial spirits to decay? For thou art with me here upon the banks of this fair river, thou, my dearest friend, my dear, dear friend, and in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart, and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister, and this prayer I make, knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. 'Tis her privilege through all the years of this our life to lead from joy to joy, for she can so inform the mind that is within us, so impress with quietness and beauty, and so feed with lofty thoughts, that neither evil tongues, rash judgments, nor the sneers of selfish men, nor greetings where no kindness is, nor all the dreary intercourse of daily life shall e'er prevail against us, or disturb our cheerful faith, that all which we behold is full of blessings. Therefore let the moon shine on thee in thy solitary walk, and let the misty mountain winds be free to blow against thee. And in after years, when these wild ecstasies shall be matured into a sober pleasure, when thy mind shall be a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. O then, if solitude or fear or pain or grief should be thy portion, with what healing thoughts of tender joy wilt thou remember me, and these my exhortations? Nor perchance if I should be where I no more can hear thy voice, nor catch from thy wild eyes these gleams of past existence, wilt thou then forget that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together, and that I, so long a worshipper of nature, hither came, unwearied in that service, rather say with warmer love, oh, with far deeper zeal of holier love? Nor wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs, and this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear both for themselves and for thy sake. Okay, so in these final lines, we learn that the speaker Wordsworth is addressing his sister Dorothy. She's with him on the banks of the river, and she is the one he has been speaking to all this time. Through his sister, he is able to see how he once was. She looks at the scenery around her as he did as a younger man 5 years ago. He goes on to say that nature is there for everyone who loves it and can benefit people to such an extent that it can protect you against evil people and the boring everyday sameness of life. Nature, when considered a faith, is full of blessings for people who believe in it, like Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy. He encourages his sister to engage with nature, to go on solitary walks, and when she grows older, to keep the memories of nature and him in her mind, and to use them when times are difficult for her. Throughout the poem, he moves from his younger self to his present self, but now, instead of moving to a future self, he talks about when he will be dead, and he begs his sister not to forget this moment in nature that they both shared and how much of a lover of nature he was. So in terms of analysis, this section is, to some degree, a final claim for his views about nature. He's addressing his sister Dorothy, but in many ways he's also addressing the reader with his philosophy. He refers to his sister as his dearest friend, and repeats for emphasis the word dear. There is true feeling here, and we know how strong their relationship was. It's important for him that she is here to share in this experience with him. He suggests that his sister is able to view the landscape and nature as he did 5 years ago. Now, this is interesting because in the earlier parts of the poem, he is saying that he didn't appreciate it on a deep enough level when he was younger. He didn't appreciate nature on a deep enough level when he was younger. So is he saying here that Dorothy's connection with nature isn't deep enough, that she, unlike him, isn't able to see into the life of things? That quote that we had from the previous first paragraph. There's also lots of religious language used in this section, and it's something that Wordsworth expressed regret about afterwards, but he didn't change it as he did with many of his other poems. We're told that nature offers protection against the sneers of selfish men and greetings where no kindness is, as well as against the dreary intercourse of everyday life. We've seen previously how Wordsworth believes nature helps him in mind, body and soul, and here he calls it our cheerful faith. The word our here is him and Dorothy, but the use of the word faith is interesting. He goes on to say that it is full of blessings. He also describes himself as a worshipper of nature and talks of his holier love for the natural world. So all of this religious language is establishing this idea that nature, for Wordsworth, is more than just a way of life or a philosophy. It's almost like a religious experience. In summary, this is a poem that on the surface is about a particular place, a landscape, but very quickly shifts focus to examine the landscape of the poet's own mind. He contrasts the change in his life, the upheaval, the consternation and stress, with the sameness of the why and the landscape around it. His life has changed dramatically, the landscape has not. It presents nature as a solution or a balm for social isolation, mental distress, or even physical pain. There are 5 verse paragraphs, but there are 3 overarching divisions. The first is where he sets the scene and details the facts, line 1 to 50 approximately. The second is where he presents his ideas about nature and its effect on man, lines 50 to 110. And the third is where he confirms these ideas through addressing his sister, and this is lines 110 through to the end. So there are 3 successive stages in his growth that he describes in the poem. They concern the personal growth or development that he has undergone, specifically to do with his relationship with nature. The first phase, in his earliest years, is when he responded to nature with glad animal movements in his boyish days. He enjoyed nature, loved it even, but didn't know anything more than that. The next phase is in his younger adult years, when he first visits the area in 1793. The next phase is in his younger adult years, when he first visits the area in 1793. Here he still loved nature, but didn't stop to think too deeply about it, and he was preoccupied with other things, like a man flying from something that he dreads. The third phase is the present for Wordsworth, and here he is no longer able to simply appreciate nature for the beauty he sees. He sees nature as something that offers him a belief system, a religion almost. It's something that bestows blessings on its followers. It can protect people from the difficulties in life and, if you're lucky, allow you to see into the life of things. Some of the things that we need to pay attention to in the poem include form, structure and language. These allow us to talk about the poem in a scholarly way. So the form of this poem is actually quite straightforward. It's 159 blank verse lines in 5 verse paragraphs. So a verse paragraph is a group of lines forming a subdivision of a poem. The length of the verse paragraph is determined by the development of the sense or a theme or a topic rather rather than by a formal stanza pattern as you might find in other poems. It's a dramatic monologue, but also a lyric. It's a dramatic monologue because it's addressed to a silent listener, Dorothy, and it's also a lyric poem because it expresses deep feelings and emotions. So in that way, we can call this a dramatic lyric. Some of the highlights that we can talk about in terms of language, we've seen lots of the things that we can talk about to do with language from our analysis of each of the sections. But some other things that we can talk more generally about is the fact that Wordsworth uses, as he intended, the language of ordinary men. There's lots of imagery used around the senses, specifically the eyes, which is interesting when we consider he uses nature as a way to see into the life of things. He could be suggesting that through really seeing nature and not simply looking at it, you can see his ideas about the unity of God and nature and man. Wordsworth uses repetition quite often in the poem for emphasis of key ideas. Again, at the beginning of the poem to show the idea of revisiting, the word and when talking about nature to almost fuse the idea of man and nature together, and the word dear when referring to Dorothy at the end. We've mentioned the structure throughout, but to summarise, the poem is broken up into 5 verse paragraphs of blank verse written in iambic pentameter, or decasyllabic meter. It's essentially the same thing. All you really need to be able to say is that the use of blank verse creates a conversational tone throughout the poem, something that Wordsworth was aiming for to make his poetry accessible. He did not want it to be standoffish or for it to seem high or arty or posh even, and the blank verse allows him to do this. The meter, however, breaks down in a few places, and it's worth paying attention to this. The meter, however, breaks down in a few places, and it's worth paying attention to this. The speaker's increased excitement causes the syntax to break down in some places, for example line 50 when the dashes are used. The hermit in line 21 and 22 is separated from the rest of the poem, just as a hermit is separated from the rest of society. The poem is also structured to move in time. The poem begins in the present, then immediately takes the reader into the past, then we come back to the present again at the end when the speaker addresses his sister. This cyclical structure, present to past to present again, is also reinforced through what the speaker is saying. He begins the poem looking out at the view before him, then the focus or the viewpoint is turned in on himself and his own mind. Then at the end, after addressing his sister, he turns his eye back to the landscape in front of him. In your essay, it's going to be important to argue a point and not simply list all of the things that you find in the poem. There are a few things in this poem that we can focus on. Firstly, Wordsworth aimed to write in the common language of men, but there are times in this poem where he fails to do that. He gets carried away and refers to the ordinary human body as a corporeal frame. He also, when addressing the river itself, uses thee and thou. This suggests that at times when he gets carried away, his convictions or beliefs shift. We know that in later life, he turned his back on many of the things he believed at the time this poem was written, specifically his sympathy with the common man and their, quote, sad music of humanity. Perhaps this inconsistent approach in his own poetry was a sign of things to come. In a similar way, the landscape that he is describing is shown to be some sort of pre-industrial rural paradise, but we know for a fact that this was not the case. William Gilpin's book, Tour of the Wye, which was published in 1782, describes an area littered with factories and furnaces, sending up clouds of smoke into the sky above. He also details homeless people taking shelter in the ruins of the abbey itself. None of this appears in Wordsworth's poem, and perhaps it is evidence of Wordsworth's airbrushing out inconveniences, as we know he also did when he wrote his autobiographical poem, The Prelude. I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and I hope that you found it useful to your study of Wordsworth. If you have, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment.